Welcome back to Chicagolandians, a casual Chicago sports podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Cunningham, joined by my co-host, Conor Cunningham.
We're two brothers from the Chicagoland area talking about the latest and greatest in Chicago sports news.
Welcome back to another episode of Chicagolandians. My name is Patrick Cunningham. I'm, of course, joined by my wonderful co-host, Conor Cunningham.
Hello.
In today's episode, following up last week's great episode where we broke down the Bears offense, we're going to be breaking down the Bears defense, highlighting each position and each starting player for each position, as well as some other key secondary role positions. Just to get started, though, we're going to go quickly over some NFL news, some exciting things that have happened since our last episode. Connor, I'm going to pass it to you first. On our note sheet, we have NFL draft trends, things that seem to be changing as we get nearer and nearer towards the draft. As of this recording, we're about a week away from the NFL draft.
Yes, great point. Now, I just wanted to ask, so next week, should listeners expect a special teams breakdown, or am I jumping the shark there?
I think we might stop with defense. I think special teams, we might have a little less to talk about.
You know, there's 3 assets to the game, but it's okay. So for sure. So I was kind of looking through some trends that I'm observing from mock drafts. In the past 2 months, I feel like I've consumed a lot of mock drafts. So I kind of just wanted to compile and talk about some of these trends that I've seen. Bleacher Report also put out an article pointing out some trends that they've seen. The first one is the idea of the Vikings trading up to draft a quarterback, probably the 4th quarterback in the draft, which would be McCarthy. So the idea of the Vikings trading up for either the 4th pick with the Cardinals or the 5th pick with the Chargers. In doing either of those, the Chargers and the Cardinals, I feel like are 2 of the top teams that would be interested in taking a receiver. So if they were to trade out, and especially with the Vikings pick, with them picking later in the draft outside of the top 10, making that trade would open up the doors for one of the 3 receivers to better fall to the Bears. And especially if McCarthy goes 4 and then Marvin Harrison is sitting at 5, I feel like that really makes it interesting to see if the Bears would trade up for him. So something interesting for sure. Another trend that I've been seeing is kind of going hand in hand with that, with the Bears trading up to the 4 or the 5 to try to draft either Malik Neighbors or Marvin Harrison, or, maybe trading up to the 6 to draft Rome Odunze. This is something that I feel like I want to think about a little more before giving my take, but, a meatball perspective would say that the idea of getting Marvin Harrison and Caleb Williams in the same draft is really appealing, and I think that'd be super cool. Obviously, you'd have to look at the compensation that we would have to give up, especially considering we only have 4 picks in this draft. I know we do have that extra 2nd round pick from next year, and hopefully we'll be picking later in the draft next year than we are currently. So maybe those assets might be less valuable, and it might be worth just trying to trade up and get Marv. But those are some things that I'm seeing. Another thing would be Chargers trading down for a tackle. I think the Chargers are at an interesting spot right now because they're at 5, which is a high value pick. They have no receiving room right now besides Quentin Johnson, who jury's still out on him being an NFL talent, but also have Jim Harbaugh coming in, so they have kind of a new regime coming in, and they're definitely in a rebuilding zone right now with a lot of their offensive playmakers leaving, big contracts with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa kind of being figured out. So I think they're at an interesting point where they might want to trade back and just acquire more talent in the draft, and that might come in the form of trading back in the draft to draft a tackle like a Fuaga or Oli. For Shanu. So that would also be interesting, again, for the same reasons of opening the door for for the Bears to draft one of those receivers. And then the last trend that I might see a lot is, Penix and Bo Nix kind of falling out of the first round. I feel like in mock drafts leading up to the drafts, as the draft gets closer, it becomes super popular to project 4 or 5 or 6 quarterbacks going in the first round. I feel like you saw this last year with Will Levis. Everyone come draft day, there was projections that the Texans were going to take Will Levis at 2. I feel like everyone gets into their head about the idea of quarterbacks going higher than they're expected to do. The year before, Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis, there's people talking about Malik Willis being a top 5 pick, and then I think he went in the 3rd round. So I think analysts or fans often think that quarterbacks are going to go more consistently in the draft than they actually do. So I would say that I would not expect Penix or Bo Nix to get drafted in the first round and only have the 4 quarterbacks taken. But yeah, those are some of the trends that we have. Obviously, the draft is this Thursday. Today's the last Sunday that we'll have without Caleb Williams, which is pretty exciting. I'm looking forward to the draft.
I wonder what the reasoning is with this, if some research could be done with these draft boosts in between the college season and the combine and then the actual draft. What causes players? Because I feel like there's certainly trends with the type of players that are getting moved up. It's almost always the quarterback. I wonder if that's just because it's more exciting to read an article about Bo Nick or like Zach Wilson getting higher because everyone has seen Zach Wilson play and like sees what a quarterback does instead of a lineman rising or projecting a lineman being taken in the first, because it's like, who's watching lineman tape when you're just watching a casual game? I wonder what that is. I wanted to touch on, Connor, that fifth, trading up for the fifth. In the event that the Cardinals trade out of the 4 to the Vikings or maybe someone outside the top 10 to then take JJ McCarthy, and then the 5th is open for someone to take Marvin Harrison, what type of capital do you think it would cost to move up from the 9th to the 5th? I've seen people say maybe that 2nd next year, but that doesn't seem like nearly enough to get like a talent like Marvin Harrison, when I assume so many teams in the NFL are going to be trying to go for that pick. What do you think it would take?
Yeah, for sure. So I feel like to trade up to the 5th, I would think it'd have to include our first for next year, especially considering the Chargers being a team that would be interested in taking Marvin Harrison to kind of get them away. Even if it's 4 spots to the 9, I still think it would require our first round pick for next year and that 2nd, which is pretty steep, especially, prospects could not pan out, but I feel like Marvin Harrison is pretty close to a sure thing, or as close as you could get, at least from my perspective. So, I feel like it'd still be something, if you could go up and do that, I feel like you don't hesitate to do it. The Texans last year traded up to get Will Anderson. I feel like they're not regretting that pick, even though they don't have a first round pick this year. I think next year, if we could have the opportunity to draft a guy like Marvin Harrison, you would do that in a heartbeat. So, this year, if he's our first round pick as well, don't worry about it. I think he could be worth 2 first round picks. So yeah, I would be all for it if we went for it. I guess don't know if that opportunity will arise, but I would be into it for sure.
Yeah, it'd be exciting to think about. I wonder if that doesn't seem necessarily like something Poles would do, trying to punt away our future by giving away future first. That's more of a past Ryan Pace move, but Poles is very calculated with value, and I trust him to hopefully make the right decision. Okay, and then the last piece of news, not necessarily news, but just media events that we wanted to highlight, was Caleb Williams was recently on the Pivot podcast with Ryan Clark, where he talked, he gave a whole podcast talking about some of the things in his career and then looking forward, some of his hopes and dreams and aspirations for the NFL. It's always exciting to see Caleb Williams in press or in the media. He's very, I'd say, reserved. Even though he's this very charismatic guy, he doesn't do a ton of interviews and isn't super public. He posts a lot on X and social media, but it's so nice to see him talk. I thought key takeaways. He mentioned that he'd love to play for a team for 20 years and chase number 12, Tom Brady, trying to be the best. I love hearing that he wants to stay with a team for a long time. And when you see the interview, it's really impressive how confident he is in his own abilities and how sure thing he is with being the number 1 pick and going to Chicago and talking about the Chicago fans and their love for football. Just his confidence that he exudes, which I think some people might think is a negative, is just something I haven't really seen before. But yeah, I just thought it's always exciting to see somebody that's excited to come to the Bears.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like a lot of times with prospects, you're kind of like, being a little coy, being about like, oh, whatever team picks me, whatever team I'm lucky to land to.
Exactly.
And I feel like since the start, Caleb's kind of just been like, I'm going number 1. I expect to go number 1. I don't expect anything else to happen, which is interesting for sure. Yeah, it's definitely exciting to hear him just straight up talk about how excited he is to go to Chicago. I think that's really cool. And yeah, I guess the idea of somebody, people can say whatever they want. I remember Josh Rosen I famously said that there was 11 mistakes made before me when I was drafted. So people love to talk about their own greatness. But it's definitely exciting to see Caleb Williams talk about being so motivated to chase Tom Brady, and especially with one team. It's exciting to hear. Yeah, for sure.
All right, so moving forward, we're going to go right into the defensive breakdown. This is going to follow a similar format to last week's offensive breakdown. But just to start, I wanted to highlight some overall defensive stats that I think reveal a little bit about how the season went for our defense and some of the things that we excelled at and some of the things we didn't excel at. So looking at overall stats, I think one of the most important stats that we'll talk about later was our turnovers. We had 28 total turnovers, which was tied for 5th in the league. A huge aspect of that was the acquisition of Montez Sweat. We'll talk about it when we get to Sweat, but he made a huge impact on the defense and led to, since his acquisition, he basically doubled our turnovers. After getting him, the Tez effect was insane. Huge highlight of our defense was our rushing game. We had the number 1 rush defense in the league. We averaged 86.4 yards per game, rushing yards per game, which is first in the league. Our pass rush, not something to write home about. We had 20 sacks, total sacks, which was 31st in the NFL. So if it wasn't Montez Sweat getting sacks, no one else was really getting sacks for us. So that's something we're looking to change in the NFL draft, and with some other acquisitions, getting a new defensive end or improving that defensive line. The other stat I wanted to highlight before getting into passing defense is our rushing defense. We are the only team since the 2012 Buccaneers to go from last or second in the previous season to first, to number 1 in run defense, which is a huge testament to the improvements that we've made within the last 2 years. This overall plan of looking forward and the progress that we've made in the last 2 years, going from last or second to last to all the way up to first in run defense, is a huge, awesome, fantastic accomplishment.
Yeah, for sure.
We should be really proud of. And then the last thing I'll say before we get into specific players is a weakness of our defense is our passing defense. I know we had a lot of interceptions, and it seemed like our secondary was studs, and we seemed like we had a lot going on. You can read stats a lot of different ways, and I think we'll talk about that later. There are things that we succeeded at and didn't exceed at, how you read those stats. But purely statistics point, we had 22 interceptions, which was tied for first in the NFL, but we were 25th in passing yards per game, 29th in passing touchdowns per game. Again, I said 31st in sacks, 24th in completion percentage, and 4th in passing attempts, which means NFL teams loved throwing on us. I think that's a testament to our stout run defense, but a lot of teams are throwing on us. Connor, do you have any takes? I was talking a lot there. Do you have any takes on those stats?
No, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I feel like from a high level, I feel like many Bears fans have the opinion that we had a great defense last year, especially like after Montez Sweat came, and especially like our scoring abilities. Like we scored a lot as a defense. I think we were we might have been the top or one of the top scoring defenses in the league, which was great. But then I do feel like the last game of the year left a sour taste in our mouth against the Packers, where Jordan Love seemingly threw all over us. And I think that kind of speaks to the secondary, which is a little frustrating considering how much resources we've put into the secondary. Like it seems earlier in the drafts, like taking Jaquan Brisker, Kyler Gordon, Tyreek Stevenson, and Eddie Jackson. All of these players were like high. Eddie Jackson was not high draft capital player, but the other 3 players we spent all second round picks on, and it's a little frustrating that like the interceptions are definitely up there, but like interceptions come from a variety of spots. Like I think Brisker only had 1 interception this year, and just the idea, like it's obvious when you look at it, like teams were not afraid to throw on us, and I think that speaks to the secondary as a whole. Like teams were not afraid to throw on us; they were afraid to run on us because we had a great run defense. I think like we gave up a ton of stats in the passing defense, and I think Brisker had an interesting season, kind of dealing with injuries, and Stevenson kind of came on late in the year, and obviously as a whole, it's hard to look at our passing defense without a full season of Montez Sweat being there. But yeah, overall, I think the passing defense could have been better for sure. And last thing, the thing you mentioned with the rush defense, I think the rush defense was great. Sacks was definitely an issue that we had. I know that's not a run defense stat, but I feel like the second edge rusher was always an issue with like Yannick Ngakoue or like DeMarcus Walker. We were just never able to get the production that we could. So I feel like that's something that we haven't really addressed yet, and I guess we'll address in the draft, but definitely something that still like leaves something to be desired.
Until the last Packers game, the Bears had not allowed a 100-yard rusher the whole season. But then that last game, Aaron Jones ran all over us. And then the Packers offense, the whole game was just dominating us. Tyreek Stevenson let up over 100 yards of passing alone, just him. And then, Aaron Jones ran all over us. So really not a great way to end for the defense.
That game lost Justin Fields' career for sure. That lost him his job too.
Legitimately, yeah. That was such a such a bad way to end the season. But then I think another interesting stat is the first half of the season versus the second half of the season, and then also how you break down those interceptions. For one, I know TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds both had 4 interceptions on their own, so they both had 8 interceptions. And then I know Tyreek Stevenson had 4 interceptions in the second half of the year, and I know those Edmonds and Edwards interceptions came at the later half of the year. So when you've got over half of our interceptions coming in the second half of the year, obviously after we got Montez Sweat, that first half of the year was rough.
Horrible.
That was when we thought we were going to get the first and second pick just from being one of the worst teams. So hopefully this year we're going to have a more balanced approach over the course of the entire season, where we have an even distribution of turnovers rather than getting them all right at the end of the season. So moving on to our actual specific player breakdown for the defense, we're first going to look at the defensive edge. This is specifically the left defensive edge, DeMarcus Walker. DeMarcus Walker, last year, he had 3.5 sacks, which was a decline from his 7 sacks before, and had 30 total sacks, which is a disappointing stat line. Currently signed to a 3-year, $21 million contract, and going into some specific stats for him, he had 19 solo tackles, tied for 63rd, 8 assists for 53rd, 4 sacks, which is 77th, and had a Pro Football Focus score of 59.1. For context, the number 20 defensive end, Pro Football Focus has a score of 82.4, so kind of puts that number in context of how...
Not very good.
Yeah, how DeMarcus Walker ranks compared to other defensive ends. Not a very good defensive end, and it's, again, like we said before, a position we're looking to fix in the NFL draft. Yeah, a lot of the stats outside top 32, outside even the top 64. Just very, very disappointing stats throughout the season.
The thing with DeMarcus Walker was last year for the Titans, he was able to produce 7 sacks. And I think, the 600 snaps that he played, or 600, I believe is 688 snaps this year, which is his career high. And I think that's like 200 more than his previous career high. So the thing with DeMarcus Walker was that he was able to produce 7 sacks last year with like pretty limited opportunity. So I feel like we were super interested in the idea of him coming in and just being able to produce 7 sacks at least on more opportunities, right? But it just seems like he fell super flat. I feel like, 30 tackles in total. I feel like 3.5 sacks in a full season played is like pretty disappointing. He played, to half his sacks compared to last year with so much more opportunity is very disappointing. And it was clear, like before Sweat came, that the people we had signed to try to fill in the edge gaps or the edge problem did not work well, especially considering we gave him like a decent amount of money compared to the rest of our defense, like with a 3-year contract. So definitely leaves something to be desired from DeMarcus Walker.
I wonder if you could talk about this, kind of how important it is to have that depth at the line. Because I don't know if it didn't necessarily happen last year because Sweat was a threat the entire year or the entire time we had him. But when you have literally one player that is producing all the sacks and like the only threat on our line, I'd imagine teams can just double him. I don't know if you can double. It might be harder to double the end because you need like a tight end to do that. But it seems like it would be so easy to scheme against our pass rush if you just have one guy. The only show in town is Montez Sweat. So that's why it's so important that we need to build some type of depth or get some type of stud defensive end to complement Sweat, or else we're just going to get shut down.
Yeah, exactly. And even that, it's like Sweat can only produce so much in a game. It's not like Sweat's going to get 3 sacks every game. If he had 3 sacks every game, he would have 40 sacks on the season. That's like double or like break the sacks record by like a mile, right? Like we need people to produce across the board. If we could have a talented rusher on the other side, it would be nice to be able to rush with like less people and have a generate pass rush from like not necessarily just strict blitzes. Like having being able to produce pressure like even just in coverage, I feel like is super helpful. So like we definitely need somebody to complement Sweat and generate pressure from the left tackle position, which is also like the more important side, right? I feel like attacking that quarterback's blind side is like super important. So to have kind of like a not talent there, not production there is concerning and something that we got to figure out. And I feel like the problem is that like last year we were like, we need to figure out edge rusher. Like, okay, something's going to happen to figure out edge rusher. And then like nothing happened when the season came. We were like, we signed Ngakoue like late in the offseason to a 1-year contract. He's not even on the roster anymore. And then people were like, oh, okay, we figured it out now. But I feel like Poles just never really addresses he doesn't address it until signing Sweat, and now I feel like you can see the holes in our defensive line. It's like Sweat is the only guy producing besides Billings creating production. And I know it's a young defensive line, but like, yeah, I feel like it's something that we're kind of just like keep pushing down the line, and we're not actually like acquiring talent besides Sweat.
Okay, moving forward, in our left defensive tackle, we have at starter, we have Andrew Billings. Connor, I'm going to pass Andrew. If you're cool, I'm going to pass Andrew Billings to you to talk about.
Yeah, for sure. So Billings, he was a super under the radar signing coming from the Raiders. When we signed him, he was signed for 1.5 or less than 1.5 guaranteed in the spring. So we signed him to a super low contract. And during the season, we signed him to a 2-year extension through 2025, which is, kind of speaks to the success that he had last year. But, he's a player, oftentimes when you hear a player, he does stuff that doesn't show up on the stat sheet. That's kind of like a red flag. But he is actually somebody that like produces a lot of valuable additions to a game that don't necessarily show up on the stat sheet. You can see he had 16 solo tackles, 11 assists, 0 sacks, with a PFF grade of 66.3. To say, I know everyone says PFF is not everything, but it's definitely something, right? It's something to look at. But he's a super solid player, and I know Eberflus speaks extremely highly of him. When he signed his extension, the Bears were allowing only 80 rushing yards per game after giving up 160 the year before. So they, like Pat mentioned, we had a terrible run defense the year before, and with the addition of other people, but mostly I feel like Billings, I feel like our rush defense was able to drastically improve, which is his main job, being in the center of our defensive line. So I feel like overall he was a great signing, and I think he's a player that like I'm super comfortable having in the middle of our line. I'm super happy with Billings. I think he's been a great signing, very solid player, and I know Eberflus calls him one of the unsung heroes of our defense. So I think he's a great signing, and excited for him to continue being a Chicago Bear.
I feel like as I'm starting my player analysis journey, I feel like the only thing that I'm able to look at right now is stats and Pro Football Focus. And so like, I'd say a score of 66.3, I'd say that is an above average. That's certainly an above average score. I think if you're looking like a pretty mid players around like 50 or 55, it's like 66.3 is a little bit above average. Certainly, I think once you get into the 70s, that's when you see like actual difference makers. But again, with stats, it's like there's a lot of things that go into stats, and it's very hard to read the whole story. And it's like if a team only runs on you, then it's hard to analyze like the sack count. Or if a team only throws on you, it's hard to look at like the tackles. So there's a lot of things that go into stats. But like you said, Connor, they certainly tell you something, right? It's a lot easier to just look at the stats than like look at every single game or every single play of a player. So just kind of putting into context how, at least for me, how I'm doing kind of my analysis on players. I know it's a little less deep. It doesn't have as much analysis as someone that maybe watches a ton of film, but it's still something to try to tell a story or give a little bit of context of the difference they did make. But of course, there is still those unsung things that you don't see that Connor kind of mentioned with each player.
Mm-hmm. For sure. He's a big guy too. He is humongous as well. He's a big boy.
So the second player that we have for defensive tackle is Zach Pickens. Actually, in last year's draft, we acquired 2 defensive linemen in Zach Pickens and Javon Dexter. Connie, do you want to talk about Zach Pickens?
Yeah, for sure. Pickens, I feel like, was an interesting player because we had already taken Dexter. Dexter was the first player we took in the second round last year. So then kind of doubling down on that like 3 technique area where, the middle of our defensive line was interesting. He is a guy who I feel like coming out of high school, he was super touted. He was the number 3 defensive tackle in his class. He was a 5-star recruit. And I feel like coming to South Carolina, he was, somewhat disappointing, especially, being a 5-star recruit and then ending up ultimately being a 3rd-round pick. I feel like he was somebody that disappointed a little in South Carolina, but I think coming into here, there was hopes that he'd really be able to like turn into something better. I think overall his season was a little like left something to be desired. I feel like he didn't have a whole lot of like meaningful production, but I think as a whole, maybe his opportunity wasn't there as much, especially compared to Dexter. Neither of them got a whole lot of opportunities, but I feel like Pickens definitely somebody that needs to improve. I would love to see him in his second year really kind of like show that he belongs to be on this roster. But I think right now he's just, growing pains as a rookie, not a lot of production. And I think he's somebody that we hope can develop to solid pieces inside of our defensive line, but just not there right now. And I wish he had shown more during his rookie season.
So I kind of want to take a quick detour and kind of talk about, I feel like when I look at our defensive line, I'm a little confused with how we were able to be such a dominant run stopping team with like our 2 defensive tackles who I would think would be like and our defensive end, like our line, other than Sweat, were kind of not huge difference makers. I think once we get to our linebackers with especially TJ Edwards, maybe that will tell a little bit of the story. But Connor, I don't know if you could maybe enlighten me a little bit about like how we were still such a good run game defense when our line seemed to struggle. What was the cause of our success?
Yeah, so I feel like it's kind of like a combination where it's like, run game is tough sometimes because a lot that goes into it. We run a 4-3 defense. We have 4 defensive linemen usually, and then our 3 linebackers. I feel like TJ Edwards and Tremaine Edmonds played pretty well in the run game as well. I think Edwards had some of the most tackles for our defense, or like in Bears history, he had some. He was a great player, but I think as a whole, run defense is hard to look at from like a stats perspective. I think that like a lot goes into it from just like filling gaps, like what we're saying with like Billings, just like taking 2 people or filling a gap or like bouncing the fullback into the running back, right? There's something that like there's a lot that goes into it, and I feel like as a whole you just look at the defensive unit, and again looking at edge pressure is tough for like run defense as well. It's mostly interior linemen and as well as the linebacking core. I think our linebacking core is super strong, and I think Billings is able to produce well. There's only one other spot for a defensive lineman where that kind of rotates in between like Pickens and Dexter. So I think as a whole, like the interior defensive line was fine with Billings for sure, and I think our linebacking core produced pretty well as well. So I think that kind of contributed to our run defense. Yeah, that's what I'd say. I feel like as a whole, though, run defense is hard to kind of look at from like an individual stats perspective, just because like a lot goes into it. Like if Aaron Donald gets like double or triple teamed, it's hard for him to produce stats, but like the impact that he's making on the game, you can't like understate that, right?
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a good way of explaining it. Okay, so moving on to our right defensive tackle, we have Trevon Dexter, Sr., who was another acquisition that we made last year, 2023 rookie. He, like Connor mentioned, had a bit of a slow start to the season, but throughout the season started to pick up more and was able to make more of a difference on the defensive line throughout the season, which I think is great to see. You like to see growth from your rookies. Obviously, at the start of the season, you're going through some changes adjusting to the league, but by the end of the season, he was still able to make an impact. By the end of the season, he had 12 quarterback hits and he had 2.5 sacks and 2 passes defended. So it's nice to see that towards the end of the season, he started to elevate his game and grow into a more of a difference maker on the defensive line, but still a long ways to go.
No, for sure. I feel like Dexter, compared to Pickens, Dexter definitely had a more productive rookie season. He was a higher drafted player. He was the first pick in the second round. So he was definitely a higher draft pick. But yeah, I think what he showed at the end of the year was definitely interesting. I think he showed growth throughout the season, and I think he's a guy who did show flashes throughout his rookie season. So definitely higher on Dexter than I would be on Pickens, I would say.
Moving on from a right defensive tackle, we're going to go right into the other side of our defensive end with Montez Sweat, who I think is probably someone that's the easiest to talk about, or there's the most to say. Sweat was this huge acquisition that we got in the middle of the season from the Commanders that Ryan Pohl, that we just, I think 5 days after signing him, or like acquiring him from the Commanders, we signed him to this 4-year extension worth $98 million. So he made a huge splash, and he really seems like he's a guy that's going to stick around for at least for a couple of years, which is very exciting. But Ryan Pohl keeps describing these players and these difference makers as multipliers, players that make not only produce a lot themselves, but also make the entire defense around them better. I think we saw that first with like Khalil Mack when we first got Khalil Mack and we had that Packers game, just seeing the instant difference he made to our entire defense. You can see how these players have an effect not only on their own game, but also every player around him. To kind of highlight that impact that Montez Sweat had once we acquired him, we kind of talked about it at the start of the episode, the difference between first and second half of the season with our turnovers. Before we had Montez Sweat, the Bears had 10 sacks and 6 interceptions in 8 games. After we acquired Sweat, our sacks doubled. We had 20 sacks, and then we had 16 interceptions in 9 games. So after acquiring Sweat, we literally doubled our sacks and our interception count, which just is a testament to how much of a difference having that dominant defensive end actually makes to our defense, and is such a testament to Sweat's ability. Some of the specific stats that I think are worth highlighting was, I think the main stat would be his sacks. He had 16 sacks, which was 6th in the league, or 6th in the NFL, which was, as we said, we only had 30 total sacks. So he had now let's say those sacks are split amongst the Commanders and the Bears, but still, I think he had about 8 or maybe 10 sacks with the Bears, a huge proportion of our total sacks. huge difference maker, 74.8 Pro Football Focus score, just an absolute monster and a huge difference maker. And I think certainly our best defensive lineman, but one of our biggest factors on defense.
Yeah, I feel like him and Jalen Johnson are two like best defensive players that we have, or most impactful for sure. I know Edwards and Edmonds are super studs, but yeah, I feel like he is such a valuable piece on our defense. He had 6 sacks last year for Chicago, 6.5 for Chicago. 6 for Chicago, 6.5 for the Commanders. But I feel like his impact was like insane last year, and he was so valuable to the team. I feel like you could just watch the whole defense kind of like transition and as you said, like multiply with Montez Sweat coming in. I know like the trade was, people were a little hesitant on the trade of acquiring him. I think we traded a 2nd round pick for him, especially for a guy who was like set to hit free agency. That was something that was like a little interesting to see, but we signed him to a 4-year extension for, $98 million. I think he's a great player and glad to have him long term. I think like we need more, I think Montez Sweat shows the impact that edge pressure can have on the defense. Like we have like our secondary could be, having edge pressure, a defensive line can help hide so many holes that you have in your defense. And I think Sweat showed that. So if we could just find something like that on the other side, obviously that's pretty much impossible to do. That's very hard to do. Easier said than done. I feel like that would be invaluable for our defense.
Seems like a very fun guy. Seems like he's always laughing, always smiling.
Yeah.
Good to see. Moving on to our linebacking core, the first linebacker that we're going to highlight is TJ Edwards, who, after doing some research on some stats, was an absolute tackling machine for our defense. Like Connor mentioned, he set a Bears record for the most tackles through 10 games with 112 tackles. 112 tackles. He finished the season with 112 solo tackles, which was ranked 5th among total linebackers in the NFL. He had 3 interceptions. I think previously I said he had 4. Had 3 interceptions, which is tied for 4th amongst linebackers. Finished with a 79.6 Pro Football score, which was 12th among all linebackers. From the 2 big acquisitions we made last year with Tremaine Edmonds and TJ Edwards, he was like by far the best acquisition we made for our defense. Has been a absolute monster statistics wise, and just a huge core piece to our defense.
Edwards is a stud, especially for the contract that we were able to give him. I feel like he has produced so well for the Bears, and I think he just produces so much from the run game perspective and from a passing perspective. Like three interceptions is great from the linebacking position. I feel like he's just a stud all around. Probably gonna extend him soon, but I think he's a great player and glad that we have him under contract. Yeah.
I didn't know he was an undrafted rookie, or he's an undrafted free agent from Wisconsin. That apparently, that always probably does something for your mental. That puts a huge chip on your shoulder that he has attributed to. He wants to prove everyone that he was wrong. They were wrong about him, which is a little corny sometimes, but it's good motivation.
Chicago area kid too.
Oh, really? I did not know that. Nice. So moving on to middle linebacker, we have Tremaine Edmonds. Connor, I'm gonna. Do you want to tackle Tremaine Edmonds?
Yeah, for sure. So Edmonds was the guy last year who was our biggest free agent signing. I think he was like one of our first free agent signings too, and definitely came at an odd time where, as we said, we had all these questions about like other roster spots that we had, and to spend a lot of assets on like an off-ball linebacker, especially coming off of the Roquan debates, I feel like made a lot of people kind of question or shake their heads. But he's a guy who's super young in the league, and I think he was drafted. I think he was like 20 years old when he was drafted. So he's been in this league for a long time and is still very young, but I think he's a leader on our defense. So he's signed a $72 million contract over 4 years. But I think overall he was able to produce a lot. He had 4 interceptions, I believe 1 touchdown, if I'm not mistaken. But he is a productive linebacker. I think he struggled a little early in the season and came on definitely at the end was able to produce a lot of both turnovers and points as well as tackles as well. I think he's a guy who his season was a little bit of a mixed bag, but overall I was happy with how he played. So he did have a pick 6, I believe, against the Browns. But yeah, I think he's a great player. I think he's a young guy who's going to be on this team for a long time, and I think I feel comfortable with him being in the middle. Yeah.
As someone that is currently 21 years old, to think about being a 20-year-old or a 19-year-old getting drafted is absurd.
Crazy.
And thinking about the type of caliber players, how big you have to be and who you're playing against is, I don't know, makes you think, what am I doing here?
Yeah, for real.
Moving on to our last linebacker, we have strong side linebacker. We have Jack Sanborn. Another.
Oh my God, sorry, Pat, sorry. He was 19 when he got drafted. He was 19, 11 months, and 24 days old. So he was 19 years old when he got drafted. That's bananas.
I don't understand how that. I was a sophomore in college when I was 9. Yeah, I don't really get how that works. I'm sure just late birthday or whatever, but that is absurd. Moving on to our last linebacker, we have Jack Sanborn, another local kid. He's a Lake Zurich product, another undrafted free agent that we had, who I think is just a great role player, not a like a standout, like standalone, huge difference maker player, but someone that's been a great kind of staple or a solid foundation piece to our defense. His stats, nothing will really blow you away, but he has 67.3 Pro Football Focus score, which kind of shows, he's I would say a decent linebacker. And kind of, as you mentioned, he has good interviews. He seems like a good guy. Kind of what he had to say about
Black Courage Award winner, baby.
Yeah. Kind of, you got anything to say about Sanborn?
Yeah, I think Sandborg was a guy who came in last year, kind of in the middle of the year, as being an undrafted free agent, and you kind of saw him on the field, and it was kind of like, oh, who's that guy? And then you're like, oh, that's Jack Sanborn, and then he slowly starts making more plays, and you're like, okay. And I feel like at the end of the season, he was a guy who was like, okay, it's pretty solid, especially being a Lake Zurich guy. It was interesting, when signing two linebackers then after Sanborn kind of being there, being like a pretty solid player, especially being undrafted. But I think he still fits in as a starter for this defense and is overall a very solid player. Yeah, Ed Black Courage Award winner, which I didn't know what that meant, but apparently all 32 teams they nominate a player for showing courage, and I guess Jack Sanborn won that. So, stand-up guy and local Chicago area kid. He had that one interception, which great stat, but I believe that was their third string quarterback playing in there when the Chiefs at one point, I think, were up by 50 points against us. But hey, stats are stats. He still got that interception. But yeah, great undrafted player. Started games for us last year. Great player. Great acquisition.
So moving on to our next position, we've got our cornerbacks and our DBs. I think undoubtedly the highlight of our defense, I think the best player that we have is one of our corners, Jalen Johnson. I'll say right off the bat, Jalen Johnson finished as the number one corner ranked by Pro Football Focus. He was an absolute animal this year. Huge difference maker. He was recognized for the Pro Bowl, second team Associated Press All-Pro.
It's all politics. That's all
kind of some politics. You have different, more exciting DBs like Sauce Gardner, who probably are better for headlines, but was an absolute monster at the corner position. Had a 33% passer rating, and if this is right, a total of 195 receiving yards against him in the entire season. Some of his stats for the year. Now, keep in mind, for these rankings, we want high rankings. You don't want to be the number one in most of these stats, but
most of them. He had
32 solo tackles, which was 93rd in the league. Again, solo tackles for DBs is kind of an interesting stat. I think you'd want higher tackles for safeties, but I think for corners, don't really want to see a ton of tackles for my DBs. Maybe a lot of tackles for losses or no gains, but that kind of makes me think you're having a lot of people completing passes on you. But had 93rd in solo tackles. He had 4 interceptions, which was ranked 5th. I think that was a huge critique to Jalen Johnson in years prior, that he couldn't actually get his hands on the ball and make those turnovers. So seeing that transition to having 4 interceptions and producing those turnovers is great to see in his growth. 85th in targets. He was thrown at 50 times throughout the entire season. 100th in receptions allowed, had 25 receptions allowed. And then obviously, as I said before, the number one ranked corner according to Pro Football Focus. He was a huge re-signing that we had this year in this free agency, and is just like the cornerstone of our defense. Such a cool player. I think recently changed his number. We talked about before. Highlight of our defense.
One of the last remnants from the Ryan Pace era, I think, along with Cole Kmet. But yeah, he in his first 3 years, he had 1 interception. So it's great to see him in this year kind of produce turnovers. He still had some he still had some plays where it was like, come on, Jalen, you had couple bad interception drops, but like I think overall he exceeded expectations. If he was on a different team, he would have been AP number one. You know, if him and Sauce had switched teams, he would have been the number one, AP number one. It's because he's on Chicago that doesn't get that recognition, but I think he's a great player. I was worried that contract negotiations weren't going to go the way that we wanted to, especially like in the middle of the season where he requested a trade from Chicago, but I'm glad Poles is able to make this work. And from both sides, it was a pretty team-friendly deal that we ended up signing. You know, having a lockdown corner is extremely important to having a quality defense, and I'm glad that we have that guy in Jalen Johnson.
Yeah, that's a great point, Connor. As the NFL evolves, having important corners is becoming more and more of invaluable. The league is transitioning to a passing league, and it already is a passing league, but it's more and more passing. So having a corner that you can lock down other receivers and make the game 10 on 10 is a huge factor. So having a lockdown corner is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Connor, do you want to talk about Terrell Smith? I see we have him mentioned, or do we not want to?
You know, no, I threw him in the dock. He's a Minnesota product. He was a 5th round pick this last year. And he was a guy who got a lot of camp buzz kind of because he was rotating in with Tyreek Stevenson. And throughout the year, him and Stevenson rotated a decent amount. So overall, he was still able to play a decent amount of real NFL snaps as a rookie, especially from 5th round pick. So I think overall he showed promise, or he showed, I think, that he belongs in the NFL, especially for a 5th round pick. He shows that he can compete and be a solid player. And I think coming from a low draft cost, especially acquiring corners, which as we've kind of hinted at, cornerback is a position that's there's no depth limit to cornerback. You can always have people playing cornerback. You can never have enough of them. It's kind of like receiver where they go down with injury all the time and you're rotating cornerbacks out all the time. So having quality players at that position is great. So I feel like I was impressed with his play. He seems like a guy who doesn't really back down from challenges, especially in camp and especially throughout the season. Especially being a guy who the Bears didn't spend a lot of draft capital on. I was super happy with the way that he played, and I think we'll see how he does in camp next year and see how his season does next year. But I think he's a guy who's going to stick around for the team for a few more years and could develop into a pretty quality starter for either the Bears or future team. But I think overall it was not a bad pick for sure, and I think he showed promise.
Dude, depth at corner cannot be
unreal.
I can't describe how many games 2 years ago, and I still feel I don't know if we had him any more last year, but where Kindle Darth Vildor was playing all the time. He would always be out there, and you're just oh,
he would sneak onto the field.
God, what? Or when Jalen Johnson would go down, and you're oh God, who do we got back there? And every time you're if Vildor is still on the team. So yeah, having that depth at corner is similar to receiver, invaluable, always good to have. So moving across left to right on the defense. So now we're going to talk about strong safety. We're going to talk about Jaquan Brisker. He just finished his second year, correct? Second year, right?
Second year. He was a rookie last year.
Second year in the NFL, who had a huge rookie season and has kind of solidified himself as that strong safety, hard-hitting safety that gets a ton of tackles, is incredibly physical, and a monster in the run defense. He had 105 tackles and 3 tackles for a loss, as well as a sack. Some of his specific stats: he had 80 solo tackles, which was 10th in the league. And then again, I guess some of the other stats, he had 47 targets, which is 16th in the league. So not great. And then 31 receptions allowed. So again, not fantastic, but strong safety stats in the passing game is a little different than a free safety statistics, because free safety is expected to be more of a passing threat. And then Connor, I think you want to highlight some of his second season, some of the changes that came with the second season. After Montez Sweat. Kind of want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I feel overall, coming from his rookie year, where Jaquan Brisker was our standout rookie from the year before, I feel he had a great rookie season. I feel this season was a little bit of a disappointment from productivity standpoint, especially like in the passing game. While he is a strong safety who plays in the box a lot, like he had 17 tackles against the Lions, which is an incredible stat. He was a little bit of a liability like in the secondary, and I think some of those stats show it. You know, he had one interception. I think he's like a young player, and I think his third year will be great, and I think he played a lot better once Montez Sweat came there. But he did have some injuries, but I think overall like his season could have gone better, especially from the way that his first season went. I know he's a guy that we all feel very confident about, leading our defense. I think he's like a talented player, but I think in coverage he could have been better. And I think I think all of us kind of think about like the late games that we had, where it seemed like, look, we got all these guys that we think are great, but like the Packers are still throwing all over us. It's like, I think all four of the players need to make up a cohesive secondary in the passing game, right? So I think, we would like to see him be a little bit better in coverage.
Yeah, I'm certainly at fault to that. I think of Brisker as just like, oh, Brisker's awesome. I remember his rookie year. He gets a ton of tackles. He hits really hard. But when you actually look at his stats, 66.7 Pro Football Focus score. For context, the number 20 safety that year was Reed Blankenship with a 73.4. So, like, not a stud safety in the NFL, right? Mm-hmm. I guess the safety position, it's free and strong safety. So like however you read that, but still needs to be more than just a run defense guy. He needs to be an active participant in our passing defense and needs to be a difference maker. Which when you actually break down the stats, he seemed like you said, Connor, maybe more of a liability than an asset. So moving on to the free safety position, we have Kevin Byard. He was our replacement. Once we let Eddie Jackson go, we acquired him from the Eagles. Kevin Byard has been in the league for a very long time. He's been selected to the first team All-Pro twice. And is this veteran safety that honestly is pretty comparable to Eddie Jackson in the type of career he's had, or like the accolades. Connor has this point where he says he's never missed a game due to injury in 8 seasons. That durability is something that is very important for all positions in football. So that's great to see. Going over some of his stats, he had 88 solo tackles. He had a Pro Football Focus score of 74. So was one of the higher ranked safeties in the NFL. I think he brings a lot of leadership, which is important to our relatively young defense. We have a lot of young players with our line and our DBs. So having this veteran presence in the locker room and someone that has proven success, someone that's a little bit older or is older, he's 31, I think is still a valuable short-term fix to the free safety position.
Yeah, for sure. So I still feel like we need a long-term solution there, but especially with Eddie Jackson leaving and having a poor season last year. Byard is a guy who was an all-pro at one point. I think he can still play at a decent level. Last year, he kind of wasn't as great as we thought he would have been for the Eagles, but I think, for a 2-year, $15 million deal, I think he's a guy who can provide a veteran presence, especially with Jackson leaving. Not a guy that you're going to get super excited about, but I think he still has production left inside of him, and I think he can be a reliable starter for our secondary.
So the last two players that we're going to highlight from the defense are our two other corners. We have Tyreek Stevenson and then Kyler Gordon. So with Tyreek Stevenson, I got very into the stats game with this last week. I think stats are so exciting. I just like looking at stats. I like looking at that data. I think it's very interesting. So I was blown away at Tyreek Stevenson's stats for the season. So just jumping right into it, he had 67 solo tackles, which was third in the NFL amongst corners, which maybe you can give a different take on it, Connor, but I do not. I don't love that stat. I think that means there are a lot of people completing a lot of passes on you, and I think we'll get to that a little bit later about why that is, but I don't love seeing my corners with a lot of, like when I played high school football, having a lot of tackles as a corner is like not great. It means a lot of people are catching balls on you. He had 4 interceptions, which is 5th in the league, but then had 110 targets, which was 2nd in the NFL. If you remember, we had 600 total targets, the Bears. So he had 1/6 of our targets. So people were really targeting him. I think that could be a testament to Jalen Johnson being a stud lockdown corner. So kind of cut off the other receiving option, so kind of just left Tyreek Stevenson, but then also had 72 receptions allowed, which is 2nd in the NFL. So he had a ton of balls thrown at him and a ton of catches on him. But I think some things that you need to note about Tyreek Stevenson is he's a rookie. This is his rookie season, and I think getting a ton of that exposure early is good for you and good for growth. One thing that Connor brought to my attention was Tyreek Stevenson's first first half of the season stats versus second half of the season stats, which I think is very, very exciting, interesting stats to look at. So if you look at the first, Stevenson played 16 games. So if you break down his first half season, his first 8 games versus his second 8 games, there are a lot of interesting stats that you'd look for. First of all, in the second half of the season, he had 4 interceptions. He didn't have any interceptions in the first half of the season. So he had a huge growth in that stat. The number of targets he had decreased by 10. He went from 63 to 53 targets in the second half of the season. His receptions that he allowed decreased by 16. He went from 43 to 27. His completion percentage, his first half completion percentage was 73.44. Pretty rough. Like 3/4 of the time they're throwing at you, they're catching the ball. But it decreased to 54%, about half of the time. And then his yards per game decreased by 15 yards, and he let up 3 less passing touchdowns at the end of the season. So I think this also helps because we got Montez Sweat, but still shows growth throughout the season and getting more comfortable in the NFL as he progresses. But I still think there's maybe something to talk about with how much he was targeted throughout the whole season.
I think rookie corners are like famously targeted a lot. I think cornerback is the hardest position, or one of the hardest positions for rookies to come in and like be successful from like day one. It's just a huge adjustment, I feel like, to be playing against insane receivers all the time. And he definitely had a rude awakening, I feel like, which came in early in the season, playing against like great receivers. Like, he played against high quality receivers like Mike. I think Mike Evans like took him for a ride. When we played Tampa, or like Devontae Adams, I feel like he had, he played against high level competition. But so I think that's just kind of like what comes with being a rookie cornerback. But I think overall he showed like resilience. For cornerbacks, rookie quarterbacks, he had the most tackles, most interceptions, was tied for the most pass deflections, and had the first most forced fumbles as a rookie cornerback. So like amongst all rookie cornerbacks. So I feel like he was an incredibly productive cornerback. I think if he wasn't even in the top 5 for voting for defensive rookie of the year, which is a joke. I think if he was like, I don't know, on the Texans or on the Jets or the Seahawks, or like somebody who was drafted in the first round, he would have been like a top 3 candidate for sure. I think he, like, very few defensive rookies produce more than him, and I think it's it's testament to him being on the Bears. But I think he's a great player. He showed a lot of resilience. I think the tackles is interesting. I think 67 is definitely a lot, but I think he's a guy who's like active in the run game, who's not afraid to like getting his helmet dirty. He had a lot of forced fumbles. I remember he had that forced fumble against Jordan Love. I think he's just a physical player who doesn't mind like hitting people, and I think it goes back and forth about like completion percentage, but I think overall like he's a solid player, and I think he was a super great draft pick. I think he was super happy with him, man.
I was just highlighting the stats because I went in thinking like Tyreek Stevenson, should have been in the conversation for defensive rookie of the year. I thought was a fantastic corner, but then to see how much he was targeted was very, very eye opening. But yeah, that's a good point. He did have a lot of those tackles. I felt like he was a very hard hitting corner that was not afraid to get involved in the run game. So then highlighting our last player before we're going to wrap up the defensive breakdown, we have Kyler Gordon. Kyler Gordon is a guy, I think this is his 3rd year, or 2nd year maybe.
2nd year. He was the same draft as Quan.
Gotcha. Right. 2nd year. He was actually taken before Brisker. He was Ryan Poles' first pick, right? He's our first pick out of Washington, who we drafted to be, we did not draft him to be a slot corner, but he's kind of assumed the role of a slot corner position. I think he's kind of solidified himself at that position. It's a little disappointing that he hasn't become a main fundamental corner and has kind of become the slot corner. But I think he excels he does what he needs to do. He was 64th in targets and had 45th in receptions allowed. So I think had good playmaking abilities when he was on defense. And when they threw him the ball, I think he was still able to hold receivers down a little bit.
Yeah. He had a terrible rookie season. Like, Kyler was a total liability his rookie year, and that probably came in with him playing on the outside more. And I know at Washington he was not a nickel cornerback, so it's definitely like not great to draft a guy in the 2nd round. You don't draft nickels in the 2nd round, but I think overall, like drafting a starter, if you can have a long-term starter, and especially like in the NFL today, like nickels play all the time, especially like nickels. The NFL plays nickels like a lot now, just because of the passing defenses that we have, the amount of passes that go on. You put a second guy in, you put an additional guy in there to be in coverage, right? So I think that's like it's becoming a more valuable position in the league now. And I think Kyler had a lot of improvement from last year. Hard not to improve from last year, but he's also a guy who was like pretty active in the run game as well. He's a guy who's still like, I know he had a couple really great plays against the Cardinals and he recorded a sack as well. So he's a guy who's like more active in the run game than I would have expected. And I think overall he showed like a lot of resilience, and he's a guy that like from year 2 had a lot of improvement. And I think it's not great that he's a nickel, especially from what he was drafted to, but I think overall I really enjoyed Kyler, and I think he was a highlight from this season.
I remember his rookie year in training camp, seeing a clip of Velus Jones cooking him.
Oh my God,
and I thought that raised a lot of questions for us. We thought,
Red flag.
It was like, is Velus Jones insane or is really good, or Kyler Gordon might have just raise some eyebrows. It was a little concerning. Yeah, that'll do it for our defensive breakdown. The last segment we're going to go over is we're going to give Connor another NFL college quiz. We've got 4 more players for him that hopefully, we'll see how you do. Are you ready, Connor?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm ready.
First player on the board is Kirk Cousins.
Michigan State.
Boom. 1. Okay. Second player, Deebo Samuel.
South Carolina.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah.
Third player, Tony Pollard.
Ooh. I don't know if I know that. Oklahoma State? I don't know if I know it. No. Way to go.
Another prominent running back on, I believe, previously on the Commanders. I don't know where he is at now. Went to the same school.
Memphis?
Yes, correct.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, Memphis. Okay.
Okay, and then last player, do you know where Cooper Kupp went to college?
Yes. Eastern Washington, right?
Boom. Yes, count it.
Yes.
Heck yeah. Nice. 3 for 4. Tony Pollard, the slip up. But impressed with Cooper Kupp. All right, Connor, do you have anything else to say? We're going to wrap up this episode.
No, last thing to say is just, Thursday marks one of the most important days in Bears history. Hopefully this marks a turning point, and looking forward to it.
So that'll do it for another episode of the Chicagolandians. I hope you guys enjoyed this defensive breakdown. I think this episode we went a little bit deeper into the stats and less of kind of the eye test, but more of the stats. Let the stats tell the story. But thank you again for listening to the end. If you enjoyed this episode, you should check out some of our previous episodes. Or if you're interested, you should check us out on social medias. We have a YouTube and a Twitter/X that we are trying to grow. You can find both of those at the Chicagolandians. But that'll do it for today's episode. And as always, bear down.
Bear down.